Welcome to the Northeast Kingdom Voice. I'm your host, Scott Wheeler. Today's guest is Amanda Gustin of the Vermont Historical Society. We're talking about catamounts, also known as mountain lions, panthers, and a few other names. Welcome to the show, Amanda.
Thanks so much for having me, Scott.
So let's start by, what is your actual title at the Historical Society?
Sure. I'm the Director of Collections and Access here at the Vermont Historical Society, which means that I supervise the department that handles our stuff, our archival materials, our library, our museum collections, and staff in that department takes care of the materials, brings in new material, helps explain it, interpret it, does further research on all of our historical material, does exhibits with it, and does sort of big research projects. We try to do at least one big research project every year in which we really focus our work on sharing things with the public.
So, I've been going to the Historical Society for years, periodically. I remember even being a kid. The first thing that stuck out to me, and it still does whenever I go there, is the big cat, the catamount, the last catamount seen in the state, and unfortunately, it ended up dead. And it's been there. So tell me a little bit about that catamount.
Sure. So first of all, you are not alone in being struck by that. It is a mounted taxidermied catamount. And it has long been one of the sort of preeminent objects in the Vermont Historical Society's collection. Sometimes in museums, we talk about sticky objects. When you're in a museum or a space and you walk by and then you just get like stuck by something, like it catches your attention and you have to sit there and look at it and learn more about it. The catamount is absolutely that for us. Calvin Coolidge said in a speech that when he was a boy and he came to the Vermont Historical Society, he was drawn immediately to that catamount. So it has absolutely been sort of one of our objects for a long time. So that particular cat was killed on Thanksgiving Day in 1881 in Barnard, Vermont. And there was a young boy named James Cadwell who was out Thanksgiving Day. He was out sort of looking for some game to put on the Thanksgiving table, and he happened upon tracks. And he knew immediately that this was not something he wanted to tangle with. So he went back and he got a number of other people. And there are a couple of conflicting accounts of exactly what happened next. But most of them eventually agree that a man named Alexander Crowell was the person. They all together, so a group of people together, tracked down this catamount. And a man named Alexander Crowell was the one who finally shot and killed the catamount. And catamounts had been very present in Vermont for a while now, but encounters with them had been growing fewer and further between. The last sort of prominent or what have you one was in 1875 in Wardsboro, where a catamount was killed. Before that, 1867 in Wethersfield. And so they're starting to get years between sighting when there used to be a couple a year. So Crowell killed this catamount, which was huge, by the way. It was almost 7 feet long from nose to tail, over 180 pounds. And Crowell had it taxidermied, stuffed, and then he sort of toured it around the state. And this tells us more about how far the catamount had receded from people's lived everyday experience, that people were willing to pay money to come and see the sort of, it was described as the monster panther. And as a brief note, in the 19th century, panther would have been the much more common term for catamount. Catamount is, and we can talk a lot about, as you mentioned, there are a lot of names for this animal. We can talk a lot about how that became so, but he would have called it a panther. So he toured it around the state, charged people admission, did not make as much money as he hoped to. It passed through a number of other hands and eventually ended up with the Vermont Historical Society, where it has been for well over 100 years now.
Okay. You know, I found it interesting. I know you've done far more research than I, but I'm working on a series now, and I don't know if you found out that uh, it actually had a bit of a court case, because the young man who actually started the hunt for it
Mm-hmm.
ended up in court against Crowell because he kept everything and he didn't share any of
Yeah,
what is it called, the money he collected for
the
killing.
receipts
Yeah,
or what
and
have you. Yeah.
yeah, and so it ended up in a court case, and the young man ended up losing. Um, you
Yeah,
know,
and Crowell also ended up in debt from this tour and sort of had to sell the Catamount just a few years later in order to satisfy his creditors. So it's an interesting like moment of the value of this thing, this taxidermied thing that we think so highly of today, and how it played out in people's imaginations even then. They thought there was more or different value to it, and tried to recoup money off of it. And so it had an interesting history even after it was shot.
the one that I don't know if I mentioned it to you in an email or not, but there was a newspaper article from, for the life of me, I can't remember what year it was. It was in the 20th century, and they were mentioning the fact that a catamount had been shot in Bakersfield. And but the funny thing is, you know how newspapers are. Newspapers at the time were very colorful. They went into detail, but sometimes they weren't totally accurate like today. And one report had it being either a small panther or some other type of wildcat, but then another article had it being a very large panther. And did you run across that story? And did you ever find anything confirming whether it was a panther or like a lynx?
Yeah. Almost certainly a lynx or a bobcat of some kind. So there are reports throughout the 20th century of either sightings or evidence left behind, tracks or scat or fur or something like that, even to like, oh, we shot this animal and we're not sure what it is. That is a fairly common thing. Today, still, Fish and Wildlife, I'm told, gets 50 to 60 sightings reported a year of catamounts in Vermont, including sometimes people will just mail them stuff, including scat, and say, I'm sure this is catamount, please investigate it, which sounds like an interesting package to get in the mail. Um, so, to the best of my knowledge, none of those have ever been substantiated. They may have like one piece of evidence, but you can't go off enough of one piece of evidence. And I believe consensus, although we weren't there aren't good enough records, right? Consensus is that was some kind of lynx or bobcat, because even the like they're kind of unmistakable animals. And for there to even have been confusion in the newspaper at the time, when people like actually shoot and actually are in the presence of a physical catamount, they tend to go, "Oh yeah, no, for sure, that's what that is."
Yeah.
So the fact that they're a little squiffy about it in the newspaper at the time
Right.
is still an indication that it was probably a large lynx or bobcat.
From what I've gotten from going through all the newspapers, and see if you think this is true, it doesn't appear even back in the quote old days that they weren't an everyday occurrence either, because
Yeah.
what I have found, when a catamount or a mountain lion or a panther, when they were spotted, it was even back in the 1800s, it was actually, the early 1800s, it was news.
Hmm.
And then, but I am no, I'm a carnivore. I like meat. In a previous chapter of my life, I hunted. I have nothing against hunting, but some of the newspaper articles about the zeal that people had in hunting these things when they were spotted, I mean, it became a community event. And the
Hmm.
newspaper articles of the time went into so much detail about how they killed the animal. As I said, I'm a meat eater, but boy, some of those articles are graphic and how much joy they got.
Yeah. The Weathersfield one has always struck me. It was trapped in a sort of pile of boulders. And the way it went on for like a day and a half, almost 2 days. They sent dogs in after it. They brought people there and back. They kept it trapped for a while. The zeal, I think, is a good word for it. So one of the interesting things about the catamount is that it gives us a window into the way Vermonters' attitudes towards nature have changed. It's in the roughly 250 years that Vermont has been a state. So the law establishing a bounty on catamounts or panthers was in the first set of laws that Vermont ever passed. And it's right alongside a law protecting deer populations and establishing sort of you can only hunt deer at these times and only this many deers, which hunters today are familiar with, that there are seasons for various hunting. And right after that, panthers and wolves are both named as please kill as many as you can. We will give you money for them from the state coffers. It establishes a system for proving that you've killed them, which is to bring the ears
Yeah.
to someone local, an official, and then write to the state treasurer for recompense. And that's so that you can't claim multiple of them. You can only claim on one. And it even like offers prorated amounts for killing young kits or pups from catamounts and wolves. And so you can see in that pairing of those two animals the early perspective that there were good animals and there were bad animals. And good animals were productive animals. They were useful animals like the deer. You can eat venison, you can cure deer hide, and there's plenty of them, and they exist for us to use as humans, and therefore they are good. Animals like the panther and the wolf, which occupies very much the same early space in Vermont imagination, are bad. They prey upon our livestock. They scare our children. They eat the animals that are for us to eat. They are predators that take away the deer herds and so on and so forth. And there really truly isn't a ton of nuance in that perspective in the late 18th and the 19th century. That's a pretty black and white kind of viewpoint. And that starts to change slowly by the middle and the late 19th century. Very famously, George Perkins Marsh publishes Man and Nature. He's a Vermonter, he's from Woodstock. And that's really one of the first books that says, you know what? Humans are part of the environment too. Humans have an impact on nature and the world around us, and we should maybe like start to think about that a little bit more. And so by the 1920s, there actually emerges a way of thinking that I think you and I are much more familiar with today, which thinks about all animals as part of a broader ecosystem, and that some animals are predators, and that's just the role that they occupy, and they are not like evil. And I think that some early Vermonters would have said, yeah, catamounts and wolves are just evil, like they're bad. But this more nuanced understanding of the early 20th century said they're just doing their part in a complicated natural world. And we should think about that instead of just trying to hunt out one type of animal and then consider another type just for our use. I mean, Vermonters hunted out deer were completely gone from the state by the 1860s. They had to be reintroduced. Deer,
Right.
beaver, elk, turkeys, for all the like, you can't drive down during a certain season a road in Vermont and not get like stopped by a turkey or a pack of turkeys crossing the road.
Right.
But they were gone from Vermont. They were deliberately reintroduced in the 20th century. So that way of thinking sort of has flip-flopped over the course of Vermont's history.
And it was interesting. when turkeys first started arriving in the Northeast Kingdom, um, I was working for the Chronicle in Barton back then, probably 30 years ago, 25 years ago. And when turkeys first started arriving here, the turkey expert, who was a very fine man, I can't remember his name at the time, he explained to me why turkeys would not survive up here, because this wasn't in the Northeast Kingdom. It wasn't turkey habitat back in the day. But so a few years later, after we have turkeys all over the place in the Northeast Kingdom, I said, what happened? He said, that's very interesting. He says, they actually learned to adapt. And he says, turkeys actually eat things in the Northeast Kingdom that they don't eat in southern Vermont. He just said they adapted, because originally he called them welfare turkeys up here. Those are his words. And because what they were doing, they were relying only on farmers' crops and such. But now they eat things. So, all right, let's move forward now. Suddenly, so we have this horrible, evil creature, which now has been transformed into the UVM Catamount,
Yeah.
Catamount Brewery, Catamount Arts. What happened? You don't usually have an evil animal.
I know. It's totally fascinating, honestly. And so a chunk of that is what I just described, like that changing understanding
Okay.
of the animal. And I also want to make clear that that perception of the catamount as bad, as undesirable, was a sort of European settler perspective. The Abenaki did have a much more nuanced view of the catamount and actually did hold it in high esteem for its role in the natural world. So there was that undercurrent and that understanding among the Abenaki before that sort of settlement idea of the catamount. And so the last catamount, I will say, this is sort of my theory and my read of how the history goes, but the last catamount is shot in 1881. And this is around about a time, actually, when a lot of things in the natural world are changing in Vermont generally. So I think a lot of people who have looked at Vermont's landscape had that understanding of at a certain point in Vermont's history, the state was largely deforested. We had largely chopped down the trees and so on. And this was about that peak time when the catamount was shot, the peak deforestation, peak sort of expansion of farms across the entire state. And after that, it's going to start to contract. The state is going to slowly start to reforest. The economy is going to change so that small farms are going to sort of be abandoned by their owners, either by choice or by economic reality. They couldn't make a go of it anymore, and they're going to subside back into the forest. And so at the same time, people are starting to have this growing understanding of the natural world. Some animals by the late 19th century, deer will be reintroduced. So there's this slow, like, reforestation, reintroduction of animals, different understanding of animals. And then in the 1920s, there's this, as I mentioned, this sort of new understanding of ecosystem and apex predators and all of that. And interestingly, as you mentioned, the UVM catamount and also the Middlebury Panther, which was actually the Middlebury College Panther, was actually the first panther mascot in Vermont in the 1920s, run smack into a trend for mascots. Which is like not the kind of thing we're so like used to thinking of sports teams and universities having mascots today. That was not at all common. And that became a trend right about in the 1920s. Before that, it was like Harvard Crimson, like, what is that? Or a couple of them had them. So UVM and Middlebury are both looking around going, oh, all the cool kids are getting mascots. We should get a mascot. And Middlebury settles pretty quickly on the Panther. And then UVM has a student body-wide debate about what their animal should be. At one point, they're very hot on the Wildcat. They really like the idea of the Wildcat. And then there's actually a news article in the UVM Cynic, the newspaper, saying, oh, shoot, UNH just became the Wildcats, guys. We got to get on this. We just lost our favorite choice. And so eventually they have a student body vote that chooses catamount and the word catamount. And this moment is also an interesting moment in the shift of the name from panther to catamount, because Middlebury goes with panther, and a few years later, UVM chooses catamount. And starting starting in the 1920s, it slowly becomes people are excited to see sightings of the catamount. They want to see the catamount in the Vermont wild. And you start to see slowly but surely more and more things named after the catamount, more and more sort of romantic portrayals of the catamount in art or poetry or fiction and things like that. Like sometimes it's still the scary bad guy, but sometimes it's also this like noble kind of animal or predator. It's the same mental space that we like ascribe to the lion, or big, beautiful, charismatic megafauna is usually how people think of them, these really incredible animals. And so by the end of the 20th century, like we're fully on board. Like every, as you say, like every time we cast around for a name, it's either Green Mountain or Catamount for something. Businesses are the Catamount. The seal for the USS Montpelier, which is a nuclear submarine, has a catamount riding a submarine. It is the coolest thing. So we're absolutely now thinking of it as a symbol of pride for Vermont, which is just a 180 for the way. And some of that, I should also mention, harkens back to a tiny little trend of early on. There's a very famous moment of symbolism for the catamount during the American Revolution, which is the tavern where the Green Mountain Boys met in Bennington to plan. Would have been known as Faye's Tavern at the time, but at some point someone had shot a catamount and sort of stuck it up outside. We don't really 100% know what it looked like, but that's the best idea that we have. And supposedly faced it towards New York as like a, we're going to scare you off. And so later on, it became known as Catamount Tavern. So there is this tiny little bit of way in which it allows us to reconnect with that origin story for Vermont as well. But even then, it's a fierce thing. It's a scary thing. We're trying to scare off New York with it.
You know, this is amazing. We only have 10 more minutes left, which is totally amazing. But that's why if you didn't have another meeting, we'd be having an hour show. So I'll have to get you back on. But just a little mention of the UVM catamount is for, as you know, for a couple years, they actually had a real cougar. And then it ended up finding a home at the Granby Zoo in Quebec. So whenever I post like whether it be the photo of the catamount at the museum, or another photo of another one of the catamounts, people always say, why does the state say they're extinct? I see one, and some people see them on a regular basis. What are they seeing? And what do you think they're seeing?
First of all, I would caveat this with I am not a wildlife biologist. I'm an historian. So I will share my best understanding of this. I think there's a couple of things going on here. One is that the catamount is so present in the Vermont imagination now that we see so many examples of it in symbols all around us that we think of it in some ways as still present. And so we are primed to want to see it or to see it. I think a lot of people don't necessarily have a ton of experience in like animal identification from a distance, in the dark, animal tracks, and things like that. And so they're seeing things that they believe are catamount that are another animal. We do have bobcats, lynx, house cat. I've seen one or two like weirdly outlined fishers that people have thought were catamounts. So the general consensus from Fish and Wildlife is that we do not currently have catamounts in the state. They're not extinct. They're actually in extremely healthy populations. They have been what we call extirpated from the state, which is that they no longer live in this habitat, but they are the animal that is out west is the mountain lion or the puma or everything like that is genetically the same animal. There was for a time a belief that the eastern catamount was a distinct subspecies, but that has largely been discredited. And so they have been driven out, hunted out of, frankly, all of the Northeast. Like they used to be up and down the eastern seaboard, Maine, Quebec, all over eastern Canada. Actually, the last catamount in the Northeast was shot in Maine in the early 20th century, and they were in the Adirondacks until the early 20th century as well. So when people report sightings of the catamount or insisting that they see the catamount, my understanding is that what biologists want is sort of two distinct points of data, at least. And the usual things that people see are photographs. But biologists also want like scat, poop from the animal. And we can actually like genetically test that. I don't really know how, but you can test that to see if it really is from a catamount. Tracks, which do have a very distinct large track. Fur, which depending on how it's separated can also be tested. And it's very rare or difficult to get two of those things to confirm that. If the catamount were identified in Vermont, they're actually described in the state's wildlife management plan. Like there actually is a sort of holding space for them as an animal that is native to Vermont and could theoretically live here. So they do have some like sense of that within the state's planning for things. And when I've talked to people, their general perspective is like, it's a matter of time, but I don't think we're there yet. They're moving east slowly. There's confirmed populations in Missouri, or as you mentioned, in Michigan now. So they may get here eventually, and we're going to have to figure out how to deal with them.
Right. All right. The one last question we talked about beforehand, because a lot of people point towards the cougar that was killed on the killed in Connecticut, hit by a car, and they say, well, that's proof they're moving. What do you? So, but you were telling me that was spotted all along the way. So there's actual proof all along the way.
Yeah, so that's actually a really well documented case. There's a good book about it. If people are interested, I would recommend that. Juvenile males or young males the catamount in general is a solitary animal, but juvenile males, especially when they're looking to establish a territory, range quite widely. They can have a territory as big as like the state of Delaware. So they absolutely do travel. And that's, I think, what the catamounts that are starting to move east, the vanguard of that is those juvenile males. And that's probably when we see a catamount in Vermont, that's probably what we're going to see first. But that cat that was killed in Connecticut, absolutely, people had it on game cameras. People had like defined biological proof that I just described all along the way. I mean, you can like pinpoint on a map its entire journey. And that's what that book does, is goes back and pairs up those sightings. And it was eventually killed by a car. And that's actually, unfortunately, not uncommon where they're more where they live. And that's one of the reasons people say that we actually haven't seen them in Vermont yet. Like no one's hit one. Depressingly.
Oh, it wasn't killed by a car?
I believe it was.
Right. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we've got to wrap up. If people want to learn more about the catamount, they can go down and visit the museum. I know you have the catamount there, and I'm sure you probably still have other material on display. Yeah.
Yeah, it's also featured in our 50 for 250 project, which is about to come out this summer, which is 50 objects telling 250 years of stories in Vermont's history. So we've just done a big new essay on it, and it'll be part of the new book.
Okay, your final words.
Thank you so much for having me, and I hope folks check out vermonthistory.org for all the good work the Vermont Historical Society does.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for your work.
Thank you, Scott.
And thank you to the viewers for tuning in to another segment of the Northeast Kingdom Voice.